G'day guys, my name is Ralph Mayhew, welcome, and today I'm going to teach you how to shoot in manual. You know that intimidating little M on your camera? You're going to be able to use that and feel confident in it by the end of this video. If you're new here, please subscribe below. If there's things you like throughout, give it the thumbs up. If there's questions you have, put it in the description below. And by the end of this, in 10 minutes flat, you're going to feel confident to go out and start shooting in manual. Let's put a timer on this and nail 10 minutes. Here it is. Photography is all about getting the right exposure. If you overexpose something, it's too bright, you lose the detail. If you underexpose it, you lose the brilliance of it. It becomes too dull. And that's why the exposure meter that you can see on the screen now is so vital when you're operating your camera in manual. The idea is to keep the little indicator right in the middle of that range to obtain the best exposure you can. There's three things that control that exposure, that cause that little indicator to move to the plus or to the minus. The first is shutter speed. The shutter speed is how long the shutter remains open for. You can have it open for a long time and let a lot of light in, or you can have it open for a millisecond and only let a tiny little bit of light in. At one end of the scale, you have 30 seconds. You can set your camera to be open for 30 seconds, and at the other end, depending on your model and what your camera is, you can set it for 1/8,000th of a second. Some it's more, some it's less. If you slow your shutter speed, so if you take it to 30 seconds, it blurs all movement. If you go the other way, it makes movement very sharp. So here's an example of that. And likewise, here's an example of low shutter speed, where the shutter's been left for 2 or 4 or 20 or 25 or 30 seconds to make that water as the waves hit the rocks really creamy and blurry and mystical. Basically, the slower your shutter speed, the blurrier the movement becomes. The faster your shutter speed, the sharper the movement. Now you must remember, with a slow shutter speed, it's really important that you have to hold the camera still, which is where a tripod comes in. The second thing you have at your disposal to control the amount of exposure is called ISO. Your camera is made to operate on the lowest ISO. It might be 50, most cameras are 100, sometimes it's 200. And your sensor is going to give you the best results when the ISO is at that number. But that also means that there's not much light coming onto the sensor. Let me give you an example. Say it's at night and you're in your living room and the lights are all on, you've been watching TV, and then in a moment you walk out of the door into the darkness, into the night, and your eyes can't see anything, and then they gradually adjust so you can see what's out there. That is bumping up your ISO. It's increasing your ISO. So indoors, perfect sight. You go outside and things are dark and hazy and grainy and a bit noisy. It's the same way the ISO works. You use ISO in really low light situations where it's hard to make things out. But the higher your ISO goes, the more quality you lose in your photograph. It becomes grainy or noisy, and that's what we want to avoid. And so you want to keep your ISO as low as possible, but sometimes that means increasing your ISO in order to take a photograph in what might be a dark situation. So the lower your ISO, the less light that comes in, but the sharper your image is. The higher your ISO, the more light, but also the more noisy your image is. Are you starting to see it's this juggling act that we need to work through? Let's talk about the third thing that we have at our disposal to control our exposure. It's called aperture. Now aperture, let me just show you this lens, is the space that's created when the lens blades are open. When they're most open, when they're at their widest, that might be a f-stop of 2.8, they let the most light in. Conversely, when you decrease the aperture or you increase the f-stop, I know it's not helpful, is it? You actually reduce the hole in the middle, which means there's less light coming in. Where you set your f-stop determines how blurry the background is. What you're doing as you increase or decrease your aperture is increasing or decreasing the depth of field. When you think about depth of field, think about the field of focus you have to play with. A very high aperture or low f-stop gives you a very narrow depth of field. Only what's in that small, thin depth of field is in focus and everything is out of focus. Just like if you increase your f-stop, if you lower your aperture, and you might put your f-stop at f-stop 18 or 20 or 22, as you do that, everything becomes in focus. There you go, you have 3 tools at your disposal to expose an image correctly. That middle line of the exposure meter. Now, exposure is measured in stops. You know, when you click your aperture up or down, you click your shutter speed, that's measuring the stops. A stop is created as a setting is doubled. So when you look at ISO, a stop is from 100 to 200 and 200 to 400. With shutter speed, it's from 1/60th to 120th to 240. From aperture, it's from 2.8 to 5.6 to 11. That's how you judge a stop, and there's increments in between those stops that you can stop at. If you take a stop off your aperture, you have to put it on your ISO or shutter speed. If you increase your ISO by a stop, you have to compensate a whole stop elsewhere for it to remain exposed. This is where manual photography really hits the ground. This is where you start having to experiment and wrestle with what you want, because photography is all about trade-offs. Regardless of what camera you want to buy or what technique you want to do, there's always a trade-off, and great photographers compensate for the trade-off. They learn how to use these 3 elements of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to bring the very best image that is least compromised by the challenge of measuring light correctly. You see, it's this balance, this kind of dance that happens between these 3 elements. The best way to learn this is to have a go. And the most important foundational element is your exposure meter. You can move your dials around, you can increase aperture, and you'll see your indicator on your exposure meter go up or down, and then you can change your shutter speed and you'll see it equalize again, and then you'll move your ISO, and you'll get a feel for how these 3 elements work together. When you increase one, you have to decrease the others. When you decrease one, you have to increase the others. You can take a stop off your aperture and you can use that half stop on ISO and shutter speed. You have that flexibility and movement in the system. Now, let me give you some bonus tips. First bonus tip, it's not easy when you start, but it's worth starting. Stick at it, and in no time at all, you'll become much, much better at it and more confident. It's all about building your confidence so you can tackle the projects that you want to tackle. You can take the photographs you want to take with the confidence of, I understand how my camera works, I understand exposure, and I can manipulate the light in this scene to achieve what I know is there to be achieved. If you want to take a photo of something and have it really, really sharp and everything else blurry, you need to use a very low f-stop. Put your f-stop down as low as it will go, and the background will get blurrier and blurrier. Inverse to that, if you want everything to be in focus, you've got a beautiful landscape, you want to increase your aperture. Move your aperture up to 18 or 16 or whatever, and that will put everything in focus, and then adjust the other elements accordingly. If you're watching something happen, a movement happen that's happening very, very quickly, and you want to freeze it, you need a high shutter speed. And so start there, increase your shutter speed, and then adjust the other elements to get your exposure correct. Likewise, if you have a waterfall and you want to make the water really blurry and silky, you need to decrease your shutter speed, and you start there and adjust everything else accordingly. And if you're shooting in a dark room, it might be at a birthday party, it might be a concert that you have to shoot, the best way to compensate for that is to increase your ISO. As you increase your ISO, you say, this is the ISO limit that I'm happy with. I'm then going to adjust everything else to suit that. The ideal aperture is right in the middle of your aperture range. So I have a lens that's a 24 to 70 and the f-stop is 4 all the way up to 22. The lens will perform best at about f-stop 11. If you're not sure where you should start or go, start there. Start on the most premium aperture setting of that lens, which is halfway between the two extremities. With ISO, start on 100 and work up. Or if it's shutter speed, look at what you want to achieve, and if it's just, I just want to take a photo of this, you start at about a 60th of a second, 1/60, and you can go up or down from there depending on the circumstances. All right, time's up. You know how to shoot manual now. The best way to do it is to stick your camera on M and start shooting things. Be encouraged. It's not always easy, sometimes it's a slog, it can be quite frustrating, but the more you do it, the more confident you'll get. And I'm not kidding, in no time at all, you'll be versed at using your camera manually, and to use it manually is to get the most out of it. And you will see the quality of your shots improve exponentially as a result of doing this. If you've got any questions, love you to put them in the description below and I'll answer them and help you sort of muddle way forward. There's so much more to photography, but this is the basics, the foundations for shooting manual really, really well. Thanks for watching. If you're new here, please subscribe. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next video.